Hi, this is Sally Morgan, physical therapist, craniosacral therapist, and Tellington T-Touch practitioner for animals and people. This is Tristan. He's a Corgi, and we're here for another technology-filled crisis conversations with a Corgi episode. My phone will not rotate, so we're just going to have to do this vertically, which is hard because now the Corgi's not as cute. Anyway, we're continuing our discussion about dogs and different vocalizing that they do. And today I want to talk a little bit about dog barking and why dogs bark. This is a problem for a lot of people. I have a friend who almost lost her subsidized housing because her emotional support dog was an incredible barker, non-stop barker, a pug, in fact, not a beagle. And though she learned to bark from a beagle, and she actually had to resort to pharmaceuticals because they were so intent to remove her from the premises that she had to stop the dog barking immediately, and she just didn't have time to do anything else. So why do dogs bark? Dogs bark at other dogs because they want to play. And we've all seen that where they run up to another dog who's kind of peeing and looking around, and they bark him up and start to encourage him to run so that they can chase him. Dogs also bark for disciplining younger dogs. Certainly I've seen this with Tristan and the baby Corgi that we know now, Arrow. The Dachshunds and Tristan have all tried to give that baby Corgi talking to, even though he's not doing anything wrong that we can see. But his attitude, I don't know, just to emphasize that we're in charge and you're a baby. But certainly we've all seen dogs bark to discipline young, and anybody who's been a breeder has seen the female dog really bark up the puppies when she's training them, and especially when it's time for them to stop nursing. She can be particularly barky with the puppies, which almost seems mean to us. Dogs also bark because they are trying to warn us of danger. That's one of the reasons that people initially included dogs in their communities. They have far better hearing and smelling than we do. And if we watch our dogs closely, we can observe when they're looking a certain direction with their ears up and their nose quivering and know that a bear is coming. Or we can also have our dogs bark if something's like a moose is trampling through our space. So dogs bark really to warn us of danger. They can also bark to threaten intruders. There's a hilarious episode of a TV show I watch where a person's living in a bad part of town and they've got a tape recording somehow connected to the door so that a dog barking starts to be really loud, like 5 Rottweilers, while you're jiggling the doorknob. So that way that person knows if there's an intruder. And certainly many of us appreciate the fact that our dogs bark to warn us of intruders. This can become a problem, however, when they're barking at things that we don't consider intruders that the dog does, such as the letter carrier or the UPS person or, your friend or your neighbor or your mother-in-law coming over. So dogs can bark. Your dogs bark if a mouse tarts. What? Jim and James, I don't know what that means. So certainly, oh, you mean your dogs bark all the time. And certainly dogs do bark a lot. In certain breeds, Pomeranians are one of them, Dachshunds, a lot of the small breeds bark a lot. Chihuahuas bark a lot. Some of the northern breeds, like Huskies, they don't bark so much. And I was talking to my friend at Corgi school last week, and she was telling me that certain lines of Corgis are known to be much bigger barkers than other lines of Corgis. I've known personally, really closely, maybe 10 Corgis, and there are those that bark a lot more than others. This one's not so barky, but the things he likes to bark at, he really wants to bark at. Dogs can also bark when they're curious, if they're like checking something out and they're like seeing what happens when they bark at it. I've seen this kind of thing happen when a dog meets a cat for the first time, or an animal that's in a little cage and the dog doesn't know what to do with it. Maybe it's a bigger animal like a guinea pig, so they bark at it because they're curious. Dogs can bark when they're excited, like when you come home from work. And a lot of people like the dog to bark when they come home from work. And this can be a problem if your dog barks excessively otherwise, because now you've got to learn yourself how to teach your dog to have an on and off switch. And barking is one of the #1 behavior issues that people come to trainers and behaviorists for, and vets actually. Dogs can bark when they're afraid. Your cardigan barks a lot, yeah. And your female barks at everything. Well, different lines of dogs bark at different things. So they can bark when they are fearful. For instance, Tristan does little barks when he hears the coyotes howling. He does not howl, but he's a little scared, and he runs under my legs and he does these little rrr, rrr, because he just doesn't know what to do, and he's really scared. I've seen other dogs bark when they're afraid during thunderstorms. There's a lot of reasons dogs can bark during a thunderstorm. It can be loud on their ears, the electrical current. If they've got like a Pomeranian with a lot of hair, that can be disturbing to them just by the change in the pressure in the air. Dogs can bark when they're bored. A lot of people, like I had this neighbor a few years ago who had 2 dogs, and he would go to work at a bank, hours, and just leave them in the backyard. And I think sometimes they could get on the porch, but sometimes the door blew shut, so they couldn't even get on the screen porch. And this was in the winter. I mean, it was like a poodle and something else, a hound, not dogs built for this. A Malamute might have been okay. But these dogs barked 8 hours a day when he did that. People might say they were bored. No. Those dogs needed attention. They wanted to come in. They wanted to be warm. They wanted to be with their person. Their family was going through a divorce. There was all kinds of stuff going on. And to leave those dogs locked outside all day, and they were completely house trained. There was no reason for this other than laziness. That was A, cruel, and B, they weren't barking because they were bored. They were barking for attention so that they could get inside and be cared for properly. So I don't know that dogs bark out of boredom. I know I had a really barky one at some point, and one of my friends jokingly said, oh, he's doing recreational barking. But he's still barking at something, a squirrel, people moving out in front of the house. Your Havanese thinks he is 50 pounds, a junkyard dog, and he barks at all the dogs that are 4 times his size. Yes, Haverneses are known to be barkers, and particularly they're alarm dogs where they come from in Cuba. So you want them to bark because if you have an intruder coming to your house, that little dog will bark a lot and let you know that somebody's out there. So some of the small breeds like Chihuahuas are the same. They really have been bred to bark it up when somebody's coming that shouldn't be there. So dogs obviously have many reasons for barking. They don't bark for no reason. And I don't think they bark just to hear themselves. One of the things I love to do with my dog when we're playing Toss the Squeaky, he will bark to get me to throw the squeaky faster. Of course, he's holding it and he won't give it to me. But if I bark at him, even the worst imitation of a dog bark, if I'm really lazy, just a little oof, he barks back at me, and then I bark twice, and he barks twice, and we get this game going where he barks 3 times, I bark 3 times, and he knows he's communicating with me, and he can see that whatever he does, I copy. If you've never done this, like you guys have these barky dogs like the Havanese, try doing this with them. It really fascinates them. And we can't communicate as well barking as a dog can, and certainly not to another dog. But I think it is one way to connect with your dog is to play this bark game and watch what they do. And like I said, a lot of people have trouble with barking dogs. That's really a huge reason why dogs contact me and Tellington T-Touch practitioners nationwide, worldwide, and behaviorists and vets is because the dog is barking. And one of the best ways to teach your dog to stop barking is to teach him to bark so that you have an on and an off switch. Now, I have to tell you, my mom has had a couple of really barky big schnauzers. I think they kind of encourage the barking because they liked having a kind of a guard dog. And just the way she works with her dogs, it would be very hard for her to teach her dog to bark and not bark because she doesn't really like the barking. And unless you're playing that game like I was telling you about where you bark at your dog, he barks back and forth, and really enjoying it, your dog doesn't understand that you want him to bark. See, poodles, they don't always bark. You're right. I've rarely known barky poodles. They do other things. But many dogs are exceptions to their breed. So to teach your dog to bark, you can encourage him to bark. When he is barking, you can give him a signal that he's barking. You can clicker train him while he is barking and give him treats for barking, and then teach him how to not bark. Doing the same thing. When he's quiet, when you ask him to be quiet please, then you can give him treats and clicker him for the off switch for the barking. And I think this works really well. But for most people, like my mom, who has excessively barking dogs, she has a really hard time trying to embrace the barking, to teach them to bark, in order to be able to teach them not to bark. And so she's resorted to the things like citronella collars, shock collars in the old days, yelling at the dogs. I've seen so many people just say, no bark, quiet. And the dog doesn't understand what that means. You have to talk to them in a whole sentence and say, I need you to be quiet now, please. And one of the things we always do in T-Touch is when a dog barks, because we're at these classes with 10 dogs barking if one barks, we always say, thank you so much for letting us know the mail has arrived. Now, can you please be quiet? And they always stop barking, because you've got 20 people with the intention that this is going to happen. And I think it makes a difference, again, if you can appreciate the barking in a way that your dog can understand, then your dog can understand that you don't want him to bark. So try the you bark once, I bark once game with your dog 3 times, 5 times, and you will be amazed at what your dog does. And then try to teach your dog to bark and not bark if you have excessive barkers. The other interesting thing you should do with your dogs, especially if you've got barky ones, is start to notice different kinds of barks. He has a very specific bark when Coco, his pal, is out in front of my house with her mom. He has a male person bark. He has a UPS bark that's different from the letter carrier bark. He has a I see deer, bear, moose, livestock in the yard bark. He doesn't bark at squirrels and things, thank God, because we've got plenty of them. He has a I see a car in the driveway bark, which changes when there's a person coming to the door from that car to the somebody's at the door bark. So try to notice the different kinds of barks that your dogs have. Oh, you have a thunder shirt on your dog when you go out. Yes, a lot of people do that. And I'll tell you, we used to rent this house on the Cape, and the dachshunds stayed there. And the people that owned the dachshunds locked them in a bedroom upstairs with music playing. And, they had to spend a lot of money to, replace the door, because the dachshunds were throwing themselves against the door to get out. The entire time we were gone, this is when the dachshunds were way younger. And when we were moving out on the final day, the neighbor very politely said, well, it's been loud, because our bedroom's right across from the room where you leave these 2 dogs, and whenever you're gone, all we hear is, Mommy, 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 help, Mommy, help, Mommy, help, implying and telling us later that the dogs barked non-stop for up to 5 hours if we weren't home. That's a lot for a neighbor to take. But the people that own the dogs didn't know, because they were never home. So after that, we did a lot of work to help those dogs stop barking. And I'm sorry the neighbor waited till 2 or 3 weeks was up before she told us, because we could have definitely intervened, certainly moving them to another room. But they had terrible separation anxiety in those days. And thunder shirts were not invented yet, so we were still using T-Touch wraps, which it's not a great thing to leave them on when you're gone for a period of time, because your dog can get tangled up. So thanks for joining us today for this episode of Conversations with a Corgi. I don't think we'll be back tomorrow, because the lawn guy that was coming today is coming tomorrow instead. But you never know. And like I said, next week I'm definitely not available Monday and Wednesday. Tuesday we may try to do an episode. I hope this phone will turn sideways again, because this is not a good angle for you guys to see the Corgi. What do you think, Biff? Thanks for joining us. Everybody have a great weekend, and get ready for another cold blast next week.